Hello, Waxahachie Global. Here we are at Chapter 13. We're talking about meiosis and sexual reproduction and sexual life cycles. So in the last chapter, we were talking about mitosis, which is how your body produces new skin cells or new muscle cells or all the various somatic cells that is made up of, makes up your body, the trillions of cells that make up your body. So if you get a cut or an injury, your body reproduces skin cells and muscle cells and the like to repair that. Or, of course, you are quite a bit larger now than you were when you were born, so that increase in size is not an increase in the size of the cells, but an increase in the number of cells, and all that occurred through mitosis. Mitosis was basically a duplication or creating clones, exact genetic copies of the cell, so the two daughter cells that resulted were an exact copy of the parent cell. Now we're going to look at a slightly different process called meiosis, or as I mentioned earlier, I used to call it meiosis, just to try to remember that this is what it took to make me. This was a combination of genetics from our parents, mom and dad, and of course this works a little bit differently in different species, but we're going to focus on the eukaryotes and talk about humans in particular, because that makes it more understandable, because obviously we have more experience with that type of thing. So chapter 13, all about meiosis and the sexual life cycles, and we'll get started in just one second. Here in our overview for the chapter, it talks about how human beings or any creature that's sexually reproduced is basically variations on a theme. Living organisms are distinguished from non-living objects by their ability to reproduce, make more of their own kind. That's one of the major concepts, or one of the major fundamental characteristics, you could say, about living things. Genetics is the study of heredity and variation. We'll talk a little bit about genetics, and then in chapters coming up, chapter 14, we'll get into more detail about genetics. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. That's what we're talking about here, is how did you inherit certain traits? Where do those traits come from? How did that information get passed on from parents down to offspring? And then, of course, variation is demonstrated by the differences in appearance that offspring show from parents and siblings. So the fact that you don't look exactly like your mom and dad, or the fact that you look perhaps somewhat like your sisters and brothers, but not exactly, that's variation that is determined by your genetics passed down from mom and dad. So family members tend to look somewhat alike. Obviously, if you had a picture of your family, you could probably pick out family members from complete strangers. So you and your mom and your sisters and your dad and your brother probably tend to look more alike than you do to some unrelated individual that you might bump into on the street. But you're obviously not exact clones, and you see that in any family portrait. So here's a family portrait that your textbook shows of Sissy Spacek and her family. Sissy Spacek is an actress. Maybe you're familiar with her, maybe not, but it doesn't really matter. You can look at her family, and you can tell that they're related. You can look at their two daughters there, and you can see, especially like in the nose of the daughter on the left here, her nose looks a lot like her dad's nose, and you can see certain features about the girls where their eyes and forehead look very much alike, and so you can kind of tell that they are related. They have a similar chin structure, and you can see that perhaps if you were to meet them on the street, you wouldn't be surprised to find out that they're family. Now, they're not exact clones of each other, and we're going to talk about how does a sibling or a child turn out to look a little bit like a parent, but not exactly alike, and what's responsible for some of this variation that you might see in your family portraits. So let's start with concept 13.1. It says offspring acquire genes from parents by inheriting chromosomes. And we'll find out what exactly the definition of a gene is, and a chromosome we should already know by now. So when someone says, you look a lot like your mom, or you have your dad's eyes, or you and your brother have the same chin, what exactly do they mean? Well, in a literal sense, of course, you don't inherit particular physical traits from your parents. What you inherit is genes. And those genes then determine those physical traits that people see on the outside. So those physical traits are kind of a manifestation of those inherited genes. So whether or not you have brown eyes, or whether or not you have a round-shaped face or a more squared-off jawline, all of those are the physical manifestations, something later we'll talk about called phenotype, of the genetics that you inherited from mom and dad. So let's talk about the definition of a gene. A gene is basically just a section or a segment of a strand of DNA. So a gene is what we call a unit of heredity. It controls a particular trait about you, some sort of physical trait or characteristic, or perhaps even a mental characteristic about you. Genes are passed on to the next generation via reproductive cells. These reproductive cells in total are called gametes. These are male sperm cells and female egg cells. And every gene has a specific location that we call a locus on that chromosome. So, for example, if we wanted to look at the gene that controls, we'll say, eye color, although usually eye color is actually controlled by multiple locus or loci, we'll say it's just simply controlled by one. So somewhere on all of the chromosomes in your cells, all these chromosomes are simply strands of DNA, there is a gene, a section of one particular strand. And that section, the locus, that location, is the gene for eye color. And so then you could identify that particular gene that was passed down from mom and dad. Most DNA is packaged into chromosomes. The vast majority of the DNA within a cell is located inside the nucleus. There is some DNA that we found out that is located inside mitochondria and then in plants and chloroplasts. That's a little bit separate from what we're talking about here. So most of the DNA is going to be in the chromosomes within the nucleus. Half of that came from each parent. We're going to focus on humans, and so Homo sapiens have 23 what we call homologous pair of chromosomes. We'll discuss what homologous means. That means you have 46 total chromosomes inside your somatic cells. Here's a great illustration to kind of explain what we're talking about. So notice this is called a chromosome, but in actuality we know this is after the chromosome has duplicated. So you're looking at two joined sister chromatids. And then if you were to stretch that out, because when you can see it like this, it's all bunched and wrapped up. But if you were to stretch that back out, it's one long thin chain or piece of DNA. Well, one section of that, and depending on the location, that's the locus, but the one section of this could be considered a gene. So notice the gene is not like a separate piece, it's actually just a location or a part of this one long strand of DNA called a chromosome. So perhaps this gene is the gene that controls hair color, or this is the gene that controls whether or not you have a flattened, sort of a pug-shaped nose, or like me, kind of a skinny, slightly crooked nose. So this one section is what we call a gene, but again, notice it's not separated, it's all one part of this one long strand which makes up a chromosome. No doubt by now you've heard through middle school and then into high school when you talked about this before that there's two different types of, or two major categories of reproduction in living things. We have asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. The one that we're going to focus in on is sexual reproduction, but we could just briefly mention asexual reproduction so we can kind of compare the two. In asexual reproduction, of course, when you add the A in front of a word, that basically means not or the opposite of. So in asexual reproduction, you have a single individual that passes on its genes, creates offspring, without the fusion of gametes. In other words, there's no mixing of genetic material to create a unique new individual. There is no mom and dad, as it were. So you're creating basically a clone. And so when you see a living creature that basically divides in half through binary fission, or you have some other method of creating a asexual reproduced creature, you're creating a clone. It's genetically identical from that parent or to that parent. So if we talked about mitosis, mitosis would be basically creating a clone. So if you wanted to think of mitosis in a way as asexual reproduction of that one skin cell, that would be similar. You're making something that is exactly a duplicate of. In sexual reproduction, of course, we have the opposite. We have two parents. We'll call them parents, even though it gets more complicated in some species. Two parents that give rise to an offspring that has a unique combination of genetics. So the offspring is going to be a separate genetic individual from each of the parents. If you want to see kind of a chart that shows the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction, you can click on this link right here. And if you want to get all geeky, when we talk about clones, we can talk a little bit about Star Wars. So Star Wars first came out in the 70s when I was a little kid, so I'm a big fan. Recall that in Star Wars, especially in the later episodes, there was a clone army that they talked about. And the clone army was made up of genetically enhanced duplicate copies of one individual. That one individual was a Mandalorian, Jango Fett. And if you'll remember, he was Boba Fett's dad. And then Boba Fett shows up later in the series, of course. And then Boba himself was an unaltered clone of Jango. That was one of the things that Jango requested, was one single unaltered clone that he could raise as a son. And then, if you'll remember, these clones later become the stormtroopers in the later episodes, which in my case came out first. So there you go, a little bit of geekology regarding clones and asexual reproduction in Star Wars. Who knew you could fit all that into one slide? There are some living creatures that do asexually reproduce as kind of a primary method of reproduction. And so here is an example of one. If you want to go and take a look at this video, I think you can right-click and hit play or hit the play button. And if you can't get this to work within the PowerPoint, if you're trying to hit play or whatever and it doesn't play, I believe I uploaded this file under the Notes folder. You're looking for something, I think, that says Hydra budding. Hydra is an aquatic creature, very kind of simple aquatic creature that does budding. And budding would be, if humans could do budding, this would be like if you woke up one morning and your pinky finger had grown a head and a face. And your little pinky finger was just kind of hanging out on your hand, but throughout the day you noticed that it started to grow arms, and then it started to grow legs, and by the end of the day it was an entire miniature version of you just hanging out there where your pinky finger used to be. And then by the next morning it was so fully formed that it could pop off and run away, and then it could eventually grow up into a whole clone of you. That's similar to budding. Plants do this. Some animals do this. It's an asexual reproduction form, and that budding, that clone that came off of your pinky finger, would be an exact genetic copy of you. There was no mixing of gametes to create that clone. So here's two examples, one from the animal kingdom, one from the plant kingdom. This is a hydra, again, a very small aquatic little creature. You'd have to usually use a microscope to see. This is the parent hydra, and you see this bud, and it's basically a miniature version of the parent, and eventually this would separate and be its own individual. Here you see it in plants, this little stand of redwood trees, 1, 2, 3, looks like about 4 redwood trees. These are actually asexual clones. The parent stump is actually in the middle, so apparently there was at one time a tree in the middle here, and it either got cut down or somehow fell over or removed. But underneath the ground there are roots and probably connections between these 4 trees. They are genetic clones. They are separate individuals. You could potentially separate them. Even if they are connected by various roots, they could be separated and moved and live on their own. So they would be considered complete separate individuals, even though they probably share the exact same genetics, and even likely in the case of the plants, share some root structure and things like that. So 2 good examples of asexual reproduction. One thing to note is that even in asexual reproduction, you have occasional mutations, genetic mutations, and then there are other methods we'll study later, where genetics can be altered somewhat, and you have some variety that appears. Not nearly like in sexual reproduction, but there are some methods for genetic change, even in an asexual reproduction. Okay, concept 13.2 says fertilization and meiosis alternate in sexual life cycles. So we're going to find out, of course, in the animal kingdom, or in the kingdom of, or I mean in all of life, there are different ways of getting this done. There are different ways of sexually reproducing. The way that humans do it or mammals do it is only one method, and there are other methods. But in all of these methods of sexual reproduction, you're going to see sort of a pattern in some way, because there's a pattern of fertilization, which is where 2 gametes join together, and then meiosis to produce those gametes. So let's take a look at that. We're going to call this a life cycle. That's the generation to generation sequence of changes or stages in reproductive history. And then we're going to say, for the most part, we're going to follow the human life cycle and find out what occurs at the cellular level. But most eukaryotic creatures follow a similar path. We will show how some differ slightly. So let's talk about humans first. Sets of chromosomes in human cells. Humans have what we call somatic cells. These are all the body cells that make you up, your skin cells and muscle cells and heart cells and liver cells and the cells that make up your eyeballs, etc. These are any cells other than the reproductive gametes that we're going to talk about. Every one of these human somatic cells has 23 pair of chromosomes. Half of that pair came from the mother, half of that pair came from the father. We're going to talk about something called a karyotype, which I'll show you a picture of. A karyotype is just simply a ordered display of all the pairs of chromosomes. They are lined up from the longest or largest chromosome down to the smallest, just so as a scientist you can look at them in an orderly fashion and kind of compare them and get various information. Oftentimes these chromosomes have been stained with a material that makes it easier for them to be seen and viewed through the microscope. So I'll show you a picture in just a moment. And then the two chromosomes in each pair are what we call homologous chromosomes. You'll notice are homologs. These are chromosomes that are alike. In other words, they have the same structure, and on the same location, they have the same genes for a particular trait. But one of them came from mom, and one of them came from dad. So the chromosomes in a homologous pair, they're not connected like the sister chromatids, but they are, we line them up side by side when we want to examine them because they are like a match set. So the chromosomes in a homologous pair are the same length and shape, and they carry genes controlling the same characteristics. Now they might not carry the same information. So at the spot on the mother gene that controls eye color, it may code for blue eyes, and on the homologous chromosome from the father's side, on the same locus for eye color, it may code for a different eye color. So that doesn't mean that the two chromosomes we're going to be looking at, the homologous pair, have the exact same information. It just means at the same location they are coding for the same trait. Okay, so let's take a look. Here's a good picture, and I'll show you even a larger picture. So here they are basically sorting chromosomes. What they've done is they've waited until the chromosomes, say, in the S phase where the chromosomes replicate. And so here what they've done is they've waited for the chromosomes to replicate and to condense. So it just makes it easier to see. So here we have two metaphase chromosomes, or actually two pairs, the sister chromatids. And notice these are connected. This is a pair of chromosomes, the sister chromatids, and this is connected, sister chromatids. But notice they're not connected to each other. These are not copies of each other. These are the homologous pairs. One of these sets came from mom, one of these came from dad. Now we can line them up together, and the way they do that, we'll look at a karyotype on the next page here. The way they do that is they simply kind of separate the chromosomes out, and then they take photographs usually. So they use a microscope to take photographs, and then they use the microscope and usually a computer to kind of sort them. So they don't actually physically move the chromosomes into this karyotype pattern you see. What they do is they take pictures of all the chromosomes, and then they basically kind of use Photoshop to pair them up and put them together and make a nice, pretty karyotype picture that you can easily see like this. So this is a human karyotype with the homolog pairs put together and stained. And some things to show. We have 23 pair, which we already discussed. They're numbered 1 through 23, starting with the longest or largest chromosome down to the smallest. And then we do have one set that's a little bit odd, which we'll talk about later. So you see 1 through 22, 22 being the smallest, 1 being the largest. And then we have this odd set. These are the sex chromosomes where we have an X and a Y. Notice that these are not homologous pairs. They don't exactly line up. We'll talk more about that later. But on all the others, they are lined up. In other words, they're the same shape and size. And like this pink portion of this particular chromosome has genes that code for particular traits, well, that will match the pink portion over here. It has genes that code for the same traits. Now, they may not code the same way, that trait. This may be blue eye color, and this may be brown eye color, but both of them are eye color, in other words. So that makes the homologous pairs. This one came from, say, mom. This one came from dad. And we line them up in a karyotype, basically just using some Photoshop skills so that we can study them and look at them and gather more information. Recall in humans, I said that we have 23 pair of chromosomes, and we do. That one set that looked kind of odd that was not homologous is called the sex chromosomes. That determines the gender of an individual, of course. These chromosomes are labeled as X and Y. Human females have a homologous pair of X chromosomes. So if the previous karyotype you looked at there on that slide was a female, you would have seen a pair of homologous chromosomes that kind of line up and look the same. One of those came from dad, one of those came from mom. Human males, however, look like what you saw in the karyotype, where they were not homologous. There's an X chromosome that is fairly regular sized looking, and then a very small Y chromosome that doesn't have nearly as much genetic information on it. The X and Y combination there, and they only share small portions that are homologous, that is what makes a human male. So these are sex chromosomes, and the other 22 pair are called autosomes. So in humans, 23 pair, 22 of which are called autosomes, and the one pair which can be different if it's an XY, which makes a male, those are the sex chromosomes. We already mentioned that each pair of these homologous chromosomes that you saw in the picture there is basically one chromosome from each parent. So chromosome pair number 1, that homologous pair, one of those came from your mom, one of those came from your dad. The 46 chromosomes in a human somatic cell, like a liver cell or a skin cell or a heart cell, are two sets of these 23. And again, I like to think of them as, say, pairs of shoes, where the left one came from mom and the right one came from dad. A diploid cell we're going to talk about has two sets of chromosomes. So all of your body cells, all your somatic cells are what we call diploid. In other words, they have two sets of chromosomes. For humans, the diploid number is 46. Since we have 23 pairs, 2n is equal to 46. Somatic cells are all diploid cells, and each species has its own characteristic diploid number. So for humans, that's 46, but for fruit flies, it's 8. For dogs, it's 78. So it has variety. There's variation depending on the species. So we call that diploid cells if they have two sets of chromosomes inside. They have the matched pair, basically, one from mom, one from dad. And that number of chromosomes is 46 for humans, 23 pair. Now, before we go any further, I want to try to make sure that we don't get confused, because we talked about in mitosis how in the S phase, when the cell is getting ready to divide, how the DNA synthesizes or creates a copy of itself, and you have chromosomes that are replicated. And then those replicated chromosomes are stuck together, and they're called sister chromatids, two identical sister chromatids. So remember, that was in mitosis in the last chapter. Those sister chromatids are not the same as these homologous pairs we're talking about. These homologous pairs we're talking about are separate from each other. One of them came from mom and one of them came from dad. They will pair up in this meiosis process that we'll see, but homologous pairs are not the same as sister chromatids. We want to make sure that we understand that, and we'll talk about that further in just a moment. So here is a picture or an illustration that might kind of help us understand. So here we're looking at a very simplified example. Let's say that this type of living creature in its cells has a 2n number of 6 instead of 46 like we do. So its 2n number is 6. In other words, it has 3 sets of chromosomes from one parent, say mom, and 3 sets from dad. So its complete number of chromosomes is 6. So let's take a look at this. In the cell that we're looking at, this is after the S phase, where the chromosomes have duplicated themselves. So prior to the S phase, you wouldn't see these sister chromatids stuck together, but there would have been 1, 2, 3 from mom, 1, 2, 3 from dad. That's all together is 6. That would be 3 pairs. Now, we've gone through the S phase here, so the chromosomes have duplicated themselves. So let's make sure that we understand. If we look at this chromosome here, these are 2 sister chromatids. After the S phase, we have some duplication. And here we have 2 sister chromatids. After the S phase, they've duplicated and they're stuck together at the centromere, remember, that little skinny waist area right at the center. So these are duplicate copies of each other, stuck together, and they are called sister chromatids. But this is the one from dad. This is the one from mom. If we look at these two sets, these are homologous pairs. So this chromosome, notice it's the same shape and length as this chromosome is. But these two are not sister chromatids. These two are homologous pairs to each other. Now, they have been duplicated in the S phase. So there is 4 chromosomes altogether here. But that's because they've been duplicated in the S phase. So this one and this one are a homologous pair. And then you could say this one and this one are a homologous pair. This one and this one are a homologous pair. So I just wanted to make sure you understand that sister chromatids are not the homologous pairs that we're talking about. Homologous pairs are non-duplicate sets where half of the set came from mom and half came from dad. It can get a little bit confusing because we are duplicating those homologous pairs as we go through meiosis. and I want to try to make sure you understand before we get that far. Let's talk a little bit about the cells that are not somatic cells, the cells that do not have a diploid number of chromosomes in them. These are called haploid cells, haploid meaning half. So haploid cells develop from a specialized type of cell in your body called germ cells, and these are located in the gonads. The gonads are reproductive structures. If you are a female, those would be the ovaries. If you are a male, those would be the testes. So a special cell is formed called a gamete, and that is either the sperm cell or the egg cell. And this specialized cell is for reproduction purposes only. It contains only a single set of chromosomes. So instead of calling it diploid, we call it haploid. And instead of having a 2n number of chromosomes, it has the n number. For example, in humans, the haploid number is 23. 23 chromosomes, and you have a pair of those. So you have 46 in total. Each set of 23 consists of the 22 autosomes we talked about and a single sex chromosome. In an unfertilized egg or ovum, the sex chromosome is always X. So the mother will always contribute X chromosome to that set of sex chromosomes. In a sperm cell, we're going to find out that the sex chromosome can either be X or Y. So the father can contribute a homologous X chromosome to the set of sex chromosomes, or can contribute the Y chromosome, and that would make the child or the eventual child into a boy. So it's the sperm cell, the combination or the contribution from the father, the sperm cell, that determines the gender or the sex of the future baby. So the mom will always give an X, the dad could possibly give an X or a Y. So let's talk about what happens when, in the human life cycle, in the whole process of fertilization and having these gametes come together. This would be how do the chromosomes behave. So fertilization is the word for the union of gametes. When the sperm and egg cell join together, you've got two haploid cells that will basically fuse and form a now new fully diploid cell. The fertilized egg is called a zygote. So we all started off as zygotes, single fertilized eggs. Unbelievable to think sometimes that you are made up of trillions of cells now, but in the very beginning you were a single fertilized egg cell called a zygote, a combination of chromosomes from each parent. The zygote produces somatic cells by mitosis and eventually develops into a full-grown adult. So you started off as a single egg cell, then that single fertilized egg cell begins to divide through mitosis, which is chapter 12, what we already talked about, and it makes more and more and more and more cells. And then through the process, those cells begin to differentiate, which we'll probably talk about more a little bit later. Some of those cells become heart cells, skin cells, muscle cells, and then that process continues to create an infant, and then, of course, into a teenager, and then into a full-grown adult. If the gametes, notice I said the gametes only have half a set of the chromosomes, and you want to think about, well, why is that the case? Well, if the gametes had a full set of chromosomes, in mitosis, every generation of that cell would then have twice as many chromosomes. So if you have a replication of the chromosomes, you would go from 46 to 92 to 184. And before long, your cell would be packed with, millions of chromosomes. So that's not the way it works. We have a process called meiosis where the number of chromosomes gets cut in half. That way, when you have the joining of the male and female portion, you are then back to the whole set of 46 that we're talking about. So in humans, again, we'll use humans as our example. At sexual maturity, so after puberty, the ovaries and the testes begin to produce haploid gametes. So these are specific cells that have half of the set of usual genetic information. Gametes are the only type of human cells that are produced by meiosis rather than mitosis. So this is a unique process that's unique for these particular cells. Meiosis results in only one set of chromosomes in each gamete, and then, of course, we already talked about this process where fertilization and meiosis kind of alternate in sexual life cycles to keep that chromosome number correct. So let's take a look at a picture or illustration here. So this is using humans, but we're going to see this type of illustration in a couple of other different living creatures as well. And I want you to note the book does a great job of kind of choosing a color code and sticking with it. So throughout the textbook, when we look at these life cycles, they're going to use aqua, this kind of bluish aqua. That's going to be the haploid stage. In other words, the stage where whatever we're looking at only has half the set of chromosomes. And then these tan arrows are going to represent the diploid stage where whatever we're looking at has the set of the pairs, the full set of chromosomes. So if we look at in humans, let's start with fertilization. So when you first began as a fertilized egg cell, that is a combination of the male sperm and the female egg that results in a zygote. That is diploid. So then through mitosis and development, that one cell divides into trillions of cells, and you end up with an adult, a multicellular diploid adult. Now, those adults, depending on if it's male or female, have testes or ovaries. Those testes and ovaries, through meiosis, produce certain haploid cells. The male produces a haploid sperm. The female produces an haploid egg. Then, at fertilization, again, those haploid cells are joined to form a diploid zygote. So this is a cycle that can be repeated over and over again. At certain parts of the cycle, we're talking about haploid cells, the gametes, and other parts of the cycle, we're talking about diploid cells and somatic cells and mitosis. So we'll see this type of chart later on. And again, just remember the aqua represents haploid and the tan sort of color represents diploid. This alternation of meiosis and fertilization going back and forth is very common among all organisms that reproduce sexually. But of course there are some variations. So we're going to look at three main types of sexual life cycles and some variation. And really the variation is kind of in how the timing works between meiosis and fertilization. So let's take a look. First we're going to look at animals. And of course that's the one that we're most familiar with because we would fall into that category. So in animals, gametes, the sex cells, either the sperm or the egg, these are the only haploid cells in the animal. And they're produced by meiosis, and then they don't undergo any further cell division before fertilization. So that sperm cell stays as a single cell, and that egg cell stays as a single cell. They don't do any sort of cell division until they join together and become a diploid. So the gametes fuse together to form a diploid zygote, and then that will go through mitosis to form a multicellular creature like yourself, made up of millions, billions, trillions of cells. So basically you could say that the animal you see, whether that's a groundhog or a human or a dog or an ant, that animal is made up of diploid cells. Its body is made up of diploid cells. Now within it, there are sperm and egg haploids, but for the most part, the animal you see is made up of diploid cells. So here we go. We do have gametes. So through meiosis, we have gametes that are created, sperm and egg cells. At fertilization, those are joined, and then the rest of this is diploid cells that are undergoing mitosis. So like at this point, where you see the living creature, the mouse, he's made up of diploid cells. Now his body, if it's a male, will produce gametes, or if it's female, will produce eggs, gametes, that are haploid. But for the most part, his life itself is within this diploid stage. Most of his cells are within the diploid stage. Let's look at some differences. How about plants and some algae? Plants and some algae, they exhibit what we call an alternation of generations. And they're slightly different. They can have life cycles, or the living part of the plant, that are either diploid or haploid in their multicellular stage. What that means is you could be looking at a plant that is mainly made up of diploid cells, like you and me, but you could be looking at a plant that you physically see that's mainly made up of haploid cells. And in this case, the diploid organism is called the sporophyte, and it makes haploid spores by meiosis. So before we get too confused, we'll look at a picture as well. Each of these spores, which is kind of like the sex cells in humans, they grow by mitosis into haploid organisms called gametophytes. The gametophyte makes haploid gametes by mitosis, and then fertilization of the gametes results in a diploid sporophyte. That is way too confusing, so hang on. We're going to look at a picture and it'll be more clear. But the gist of this is that the plant that you see, if you physically see a plant, say you're walking in the woods, it could be made up of haploid or diploid cells depending on what point it's in its particular life cycle. So let's take a look at a picture. Alright, so let's start with fertilization. So at fertilization, you have two haploid cells that join together. They formed a zygote. Then that zygote reproduced through mitosis to create the creature you see. So here is a plant at a particular stage in its life, and it's diploid, multicellular creature. That diploid cell, those diploid plants, through meiosis, produce particular haploid cells, or we would call them sex cells in humans, but in this case they're called spores. Well, unlike in humans, where a sperm cell doesn't begin to divide and create a human, or an egg cell doesn't begin to divide and create a human, these spores, however, can do that. So sperm cells don't undergo mitosis, and egg cells in humans don't undergo mitosis. But in plants and some algae, the equivalent to the sperm and egg, the spores, they will start to divide, undergo mitosis, and create a multicellular living creature that is haploid. It has half the set of usual chromosomes. So the plant you see when you're walking in the woods, it could be in its haploid stage, or it could be in its diploid stage. There's probably ways to tell. You can see the diploid probably has reproductive parts to it and the haploid does not. But the living creature you see could be part of the haploid stage. That creature, through mitosis, can create, again, more of the haploid cells that are kind of be considered like the sex cells in humans. And then those can be combined. So you might have this plant and another plant that lives out here. Those haploid cells be combined through fertilization to create another diploid zygote, and the process can start over again. So the main difference between the plants here and the humans is that in humans, single egg cells don't start to divide and create humans. The single sperm cells don't start to divide through mitosis and create humans. But in these plants, the spores, which are the equivalents, they can do that. And so part of the life cycle of this plant may be in different stages, where it's haploid in one stage, diploid in another. Not something you're going to see in mammals, but it does occur in other species. The last variation on this theme is with most of your fungi and some protists. So we're talking mushrooms and molds, and then some of your smaller multicellular microscopic creatures called protists. In most fungi and some protists, the only diploid stage is the single-celled zygote. There is no multicellular diploid stage. That's completely the reverse of us. For humans, the multicellular stage is always diploid. Our somatic cells are diploid. But in this case, it's just the opposite, where the only diploid stage is the single-celled zygote. And what you see when you see the mushroom or the mold or the slime, that's actually in the haploid stage. The zygote produces haploid cells by meiosis, and then each haploid cell grows by mitosis into that multicellular organism, and then the haploid adult produces gametes by mitosis. So the upside, or the gist of this, is the fungi or protists you see is made up of haploid cells. Again, let's look at a chart so it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So we'll start with fertilization. You have two gametes come together to form a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote undergoes meiosis to form haploid cells, which then undergo mitosis to form the creature that you see. So in this case, the mushroom you see, or the protist that you see, is going to be in the haploid state. So the living creature you see is haploid, and the only diploid part is the zygote, the single-celled zygote, for a very short amount of time. So this is kind of the reverse of us, where the living creature that you see is in the haploid stage, and the kind of reproduction part is in the diploid stage. It's kind of the opposite of us. So from this, we could kind of go back to the three summaries. So in animals, the animal you see, the body that you see, the mouse or the elephant, is made up of diploid cells. In plants and algae, it depends. The animal, the physical thing you see, the plant, as you're walking through the forest, it could be haploid or diploid depending on whatever stage of its life cycle. And then in the fungi or the protists, what you see, the mushroom or the protist you're looking at underneath the microscope, it's in the haploid stage. It's made up of haploid cells. So you see they all follow a pattern of fertilization, meiosis, mitosis, but the way they do it and the timing and at which part are you seeing the physical body basically of the creature, that's different for all of these. So depending on which creature we're talking about and depending on the type of life cycle, haploid cells, which have half the set of chromosomes, or diploid cells, which have the full set, they can both divide by mitosis. Haploid cells can undergo mitosis, diploid cells can undergo mitosis, but only the diploid cells can undergo meiosis. Because if you try to undergo meiosis with a haploid cell, well, they only have a single set. How can you divide a single set? Well, you can't. So since haploid cells only have a single set of chromosomes, you can't divide them up the way you can a double set in diploid cells when they undergo meiosis. In all three life cycles, halving and the doubling of the chromosomes, this process contributes to genetic variation in the offspring. So it doesn't matter if we're looking at a fungus or a plant or a human, this process of sexual reproduction is a process of combining genetics from multiple parents, and so you are getting unique variation within the offspring. They're just doing it in slightly different methods or slightly different ways. Here's a comparison of all three. This is a great slide to look at comparing the animals, the plants, some algae, and then the fungi, most of the fungi, and some of the protists. Notice they all have tan diploid parts. They all have aqua haploid portions, but the point at which you see the physical bodies kind of falls differently. Down here, it's the animals in the diploid stage. Plants could be haploid or diploid, and then these guys tend to be in the haploid stage when you see the physical bodies. But notice the cycles actually are a lot alike. There's just variations on the theme or variations on the timing. We're going to take a break right there. When we come back, we'll finish up with concept 13.3. That's all about the entire process of meiosis. You're going to find out that process is basically just mitosis times 2 with maybe 1 or 2 cool things thrown in there. So we'll stop right here and take a break. Come back in just a minute. I'll see you soon.